What stretch should I do to fix insert your pain problem here? The truth is, almost no stretch is going to be a recommendation that I give to most clients. Why? Because it's freaking overrated, man. I cannot think of a bigger waste of time than stretching a muscle or tissue that hurts. Why? A, it feels tight because your brain is trying to use stiffness as a way to create some kind of control or stability over that area. So just stretching it out is probably a lot like scratching poison ivy. Feels great while you're doing it, but it's probably making the problem worse and not better. The second part is we have multiple research data to support this idea that stretching down-regulates the neuromuscular connection, meaning you'll lose strength, you'll lose some motor control, and you'll lose the ability to produce power. So if we're really trying to get people to move better and feel better, we can probably spend that same amount of time doing almost anything else. A dynamic warm-up, isometrics, some type of strength training. Just please stop stretching.
My name is Paul Chek, and I have a very alternative view of Mr. Stella's comments on stretching. And I'll be polite about it. One, there are many different types of stretching. For example, in my book, The Golf Biomechanics Manual, I have a very comprehensive chapter on stretching that addresses much more than I can address here in a short response to this. But these things get sent to me from people all over the world, particularly CHEK professionals, because they think some of this information is dangerous and they want my opinion on it. So I will share that number one, he talked about stretching when you're in pain. Stretching is a way to modulate pain. When you have a reaction to pain, you get contraction of the muscles because they're responding either to the injured tissue to try to stabilize it, or they're responding to the trauma themselves, and the reaction is to tighten because, without getting too technical, you have two types of muscle systems. Three, actually, if you include the smooth muscles. You have tonic muscles, which are muscles that are oriented toward postural stability, and they have aerobic metabolism, so they can work for long periods of time, but they have low threshold motor units, which means they're easily excitable. They also work largely to stabilize the body during dynamic movements. The phasic muscles have predominantly fast twitch muscle fiber in them, and they have a high motor unit threshold because they consume a lot of energy, so the body is set up to use minimum amounts of energy. So whenever you have trauma, which is overabuse, abuse, underuse, or disuse, including trauma, then you're going to have activation of tonic muscle fibers as a guarding reaction. The problem is anytime you've got pain, that guarding reaction, if unabated, causes constriction because the elevated muscle tone reduces circulation through the area, which causes an increase of metabolic waste, which leads to acidosis or acidic buildup in the tissues, which can then further irritate and traumatize the tissues and cause the development of trigger points, which then send pain to other regions of the body and trigger problems there. So we have to consider the fact that when you have reduced circulation, you're not only decreasing blood flow in and oxygen in, you're blocking removal of waste, which causes this pooling of metabolic waste and irritates the surrounding tissues. So stretching can be used intelligently to actually increase blood flow, bring in more oxygen and nutrition, speed healing, and as long as you know what you're doing, stretching can be a very great aid to reduce pain, improve motor performance, improve muscle balance, improve nutrient delivery and oxygen delivery. But if you don't know what you're doing, well, that's why I teach a course called Scientific Stretching, and that's why CHEK professionals go through a lot of training on the science of assessment and how to use stretching intelligently and for corrective purposes. The other thing is that depending on the type of stretching you're using, you're going to get different responses. If you use contract-relax stretching, for example, where you take a muscle to an end range and then push against yourself isometrically for 5 seconds and then release and open for 5, then you're going to have down regulation of the motor units of the tight muscles, but it's only for a window of time that is not that long. The goal then is to couple that stretching with corrective exercises, because whenever you have excitation in one muscle, hopefully the one you're stretching, it reflexively inhibits its antagonist. So the other issue is where you have tight muscles, you're actually getting postural regulation. In other words, the tight muscles are pulling the bones in a given direction. So if your abdominals are too tight, it'll pull your head down and forward. So if you stretch them, that releases the amount of inhibition of the back extensors. So think of a spring being pulled in the front, it stretches the one in the back. But when this one's turned on, the antagonist is inhibited. This is very basic physiological knowledge. So if you stretch your abdominals and then do an exercise like a prone cobra or a row or a bent over row, then you will have a window where the inhibition of the abdominal muscles facilitates activation of the opposite muscles, which makes it easier to make postural correction if you're doing this in a scientific format where you're doing scheduled exercise for corrective purposes. The other thing is, it's very important to realize that all of your organs and glands connect to the muscular system. The organs are really the chief consciousness behind the activity of the muscles. For example, if you're hungry, your stomach tells your motor system to go find food. If you've got to poop, it tells your legs to relax and squat so you can poop. If you want to make love to somebody, it tells you get up and go find a mate. So without going through all the organs, they each have neurological connections, and I show this right in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, for example. But what we need to be aware of is that through what's called the sympathetic chain ganglia, because the organs do not have their own sensory nerve endings, they borrow their sensory capacity from the musculoskeletal system. So for example, the innervation to your heart is T1 through 4, and that's the thoracic region, and that includes the left arm. So when people have a heart attack, they get pain in their left arm and chest, but nobody goes to the doctor and says, my heart is in pain, because you don't have sensory neurons in there. So the heart sends its pain through the neurons that it shares a connection with through the nervous system. And so the point is, when you have chronic ailments, or you have a low-level disease process or a high-level disease process, or you have inflammation in a gland or an organ, it will reflexively send that excitation. Remember, the word dis-ease means dis-ease. So if each gland and organ has a threshold or a frequency range that its energy works in. So if you go above that frequency range, you get excitation, and the word dis-ease means that the system burns itself out because it's overly excited. So for example, when the heart is inflamed or irritated, and we all know there's a lot of heart inflammation going on out there for obvious reasons, then what happens is the heart has to buffer its stress by sending that excess electrical activity through the muscles that it has a relationship with. So it's very, very common for people with liver problems, with stomach problems, with bladder infections, with heart problems, literally every digestive disorders, to have changes in the tone of the muscles and not realize what it's coming from. So what the organs and glands do is they send this excess energy into the muscles, which causes the muscle to tighten, and depending on which muscles, that can change the orientation of the joints and the bones. Therefore, you have a change in what's called the optimal instantaneous axis of rotation. For example, if you have something causing your biceps to tighten, but it's not causing a reciprocal tightening of the triceps, the tension in the biceps will shift the head of the humerus and the socket, which over time can lead to a labral dysfunction or an impingement syndrome. So the key point that I'm making is, I teach CHEK professionals how to read the muscular system by knowing the relationships with each of the glands and organs, and they can use that assessment to identify which glands and organs are overexcited, and then correlate that with diet and lifestyle factors and another variety of assessments that looks at specific gland and organ function. And you can use stretching to decrease the stress on the muscle that's compensating for the organ, because if the organ's been chronically inflamed, the muscle stays chronically excited, which leads to chronic postural problems, decreased blood supply, and all the things I mentioned earlier. And if you look at the book Occupational Biomechanics by Gunnar B.J. Anderson, he shows blood flow studies in there in which he identified the fact that even a 5% contraction of a muscle can reduce blood flow through the muscle as much as 75%. So when you even have light increases in motor tone due to injury and pain, due to gland and organ inflammation and other problems, you can actually have enough increase in the tone to drastically reduce blood supply, which is why so many people with tight necks get tension headaches, because it's constricting blood flow up into the head and the brain. So you can also have a viscero-excitatory or a viscero-inhibitory response, and this can lead to muscles that are actually more lax than normal. And if you have muscles, say for example, that are in a viscero-inhibitory state because of a chronic inflammatory problem or a disease process, if you don't stretch the muscle on the other side, it can throw the joint out of balance. And so you would have to work on exciting the muscle that's shut down, and you'd have to work on calming the muscle so you can get the opposite muscle on the other side of the joint, so you can bring structural alignment back in. But none of these things that we do in the CHEK system on the musculoskeletal system are done in isolation. In other words, you don't just stretch and not look at diet and lifestyle factors. You don't just stretch and not look at medical history, injury history, postural alignment, and things like, has this person had a ligament injury, a labral tear, etc. Any of these things done in isolation is really like walking blind. It's like a mechanic with only one tool. As the old saying goes, if all you've got in your pocket is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So in a nutshell, the last comment I would make is that we also have to consider that most of people's tightness, certainly in general, comes from excitation of the nervous system due to a variety of psychological factors and physiological factors like I've meant. But we have adaptive changes, such as right-handed tennis players whose shoulder will be lower due to the tension in the lats and the additional strength in their right arm versus their left arm, and pronated, turned in. So we can use stretching to correct handedness patterns or sport-specific movement patterns, which I've had to do thousands of times for all sorts of amateur and elite athletes. But if we have fascial binding or fascial restriction, we have to use a different type of stretching. Now we have to go to long hold stretching to give the ground substance of the fascia a chance to break down, because stretching produces heat, which causes connective tissues to relax. So there's a time when we want long, slow hold stretching, and there's a time when we want shorter contract, relax type stretching or post-isometric relaxation, because, for example, you don't want to stretch fascia and change the length of the muscle unit, muscle tendon unit too much right before you're going to do an exercise, because the brain will not recognize that muscle as a normal part of the motor program, because it stores the memory of the length of your muscles and the activity of the exercise that you're doing, the general motor pattern. So if you, for example, are a golfer and you need accuracy, or a pitcher and you've got to throw a strike, if I stretch your arm out or over-rotate your spine with a long, slow hold stretch, as soon as you go to do the exercise, your brain tries to change the length of the muscle to bring it back to what it has in its memory, or the motor program that you've built in your nervous system. So these are just a few of the things that are not being considered here. And this advice, if taken by the ordinary person, could probably end up increasing the likelihood that they're going to get injured. But in all fairness, most people don't know any more about stretching than they do about nuclear physics. And unfortunately, a lot of trainers, and I see Mike here as an athletic trainer certified, most people in universities don't learn these things either. Why? How do I know that? Because I've lectured in universities and medical schools and chiropractic schools and osteopathic schools, and I have a multidisciplinary education system, and I've worked with professional sports teams all over the world and their doctors and therapists and had to teach them these things. And most of them don't have enough knowledge of anatomy to understand what they're working with. Stretching is a science. but it's not a science that can be used by itself. You cannot be effective with stretching if you don't understand anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, kinesiology, physiology, internal integration of systems. And then we barely touched on the fact that if you, for example, look at the research by Arsavir Arat, MD, who was the first one to show scientifically in 1972 that the limbic system of the brain, which handles your emotions, sends excess energy into the tonic muscles, beginning with the temporalis, the masseter, the levator scapula, and the upper trapezius, and then distributing it down from there, which is why most of us know that when we're under a lot of stress, our traps get really tight, or we get tension in our jaw, which can lead to temporomandibular joint problems, or we get tension headaches for the same reason. Remember, the brain is an organ, so when it gets overly excited, it has to dissipate that energy to protect the organ from overexcitation, because it'll overstress the organ. And you won't die if you lose a muscle, but you will die if you lose your brain or your heart. So the muscles actually work like a fuse box works, just the way if you plug too many things into a circuit at your house and blow the breaker, when your system, the internal systems that I'm talking about, glands and organs, for example, have too much energy, they don't blow a breaker, they use the muscle as the breaker. So the muscle absorbs the energy, the contraction of the muscle that's caused by the overstimulation from the organ, converts the muscle tension into heat and dissipates that energy out of your body. So, you know, I'm sure Mike's giving you his best shot based on his experience and his training. But CHEK professionals spend 5 years in training learning these things inside out and backwards so that they can actually guide people intelligently and accurately, help them alleviate pain, help them improve internal function, external function, and psychological function as a holistic whole, so that we can actually support people in creating and living their dreams and achieving their goals, be it athletically or just to live well and feel good in life. So those are some of the comments. I go much deeper in this information in scientific, well, my scientific stretching workshop, which I don't do that often anymore. It might be online if you look at the CHEK Institute in the online section. But in my Golf Biomechanics Manual, there's a comprehensive chapter on stretching. And in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, I show you how to do 20 stretch tests to test the tonic muscles, or the muscles, tonic and phasic, but I show you how to access the muscles that most commonly tighten in people and how to do a corrective stretching program with postural considerations, how to mobilize joints. That's the other thing. If joints aren't working properly, they'll cause muscle tightness. If joints are too lax, they can cause looseness on one side of the joint and tightness on the other side of the joint, which leads to more problems. So in a few minutes here, I've given you a bit of a summary, but you know, I'm just summarizing what takes, you know, often hours of lecture for me to point out, and then many, many hours of practical training for specific assessment of what's called a length tension assessment, to look at the actual balance of the muscles, because quite frankly, the balance of the muscles tells you a lot about the balance of the nervous system, and you can even go to the hormonal system, for it would be too much to get into, and it also tells you about their psychological state. Remember, 55% of language is posture and gesture. So we forget that the way our body is being held tells us a lot about somebody's mental state, about what conscious and unconscious thoughts, feelings, and emotions they're trying to convey to us. And stretching can be used to help people out of depressive states. And so can the use of foam rollers to create localized stretching, such as stretching the abdominal wall by using the foam roller to disengage the actin and myosin filaments in key areas, such as right under the diaphragmatic arch. And you can have significant psychological improvements just by using therapeutic approaches with things like pressure treatment through foam rollers and a scientific application of stretching. So in a nutshell, there is a science to stretching, and you do need to understand anatomy and physiology and all the things I mentioned earlier to do it scientifically. Otherwise, what happens is you get on your phone and you get very, very misled, and you can end up in more pain, worsening orthopedic injuries, and spending a lot of money to buy a car for an orthopedic surgeon that you don't get to choose the color of. So cheers. Hopefully you'll look into my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, for a more in-depth look, which that's plenty in-depth for most people. The Golf Biomechanics Manual has a complete and comprehensive chapter on stretching. And hopefully, Mike, you'll read it, because I'd love to see you expand your understanding of the science of stretching and help more people. And we all need more wise people that know how to help people. And we should be careful about saying things that aren't well researched or understood, so we don't confuse people and facilitate more pain and problems in their life. So that's my thoughts.